proud to say a piece of work was done at Sydney Children's Hospital, and it was really around the challenges we have in transferring a child from the emergency department to the ICU and trying to standardise that process. And that's been a piece of work that has resulted in a more standardised process. Jane Cichero is the nurse educator at Sydney Children's Emergency Department, and she was involved in this piece of work. Jane's had got an extensive career in nurse education, and most of that's been working with in the critical care environment, working with nurses who work in that arena as well. So, welcome.
I think I'm preaching to the converted down here. I do feel like it's a hard act to follow when I follow Kate and Alexandra, isn't it? Who always blow me away with their research, and I feel that so often I'm involved in lovely little projects which make a difference, I know, but I always feel like it's so nothing as compared to what we should be doing. I'll stop doing it. No, don't. Anyway, so good morning to those who are here. Let me just check my little... Okay, so this was a project I sort of wasn't involved with at the beginning, but in my role as simulation nurse lead in the emergency department, I sort of became involved with as we went, so that'll become clear. So I'm not claiming any kudos for the actual thoughts behind this and the project team, and I wanted to acknowledge that the project team from ED and ICU did mostly all the work, and so I just want to make sure that they get their recognition. So the aim of the project, the aim of this session is just to give you a bit of an overview of the project, how we tested it, how we did a bit of a pilot test, what the final test and product was essentially, how we sort of educated and implemented it, and then what some of the evaluations and the results of the project were. So essentially in our hospital what happened was that we were getting some anecdotal feedback from people, often from ICU, to say that we weren't doing a very good job of handing over our critically ill or injured children when we got to the ICU. So out of that, a bit of a quality improvement project was developed, and they wanted to explore sort of the handover process of that critically ill or injured child to the ICU team. So a group was put together, and that sort of consisted of ED registered nurses and ICU registered nurses. There was clinical NUMs from both areas, and then there was a medical consultant from both areas too, and the quality manager from the hospital was also involved too. So they sort of came together, and really the aims of the project was to evaluate the effectiveness of the existing handover, identify barriers to the effective handover, and implement any changes that could be found to standardise the transfer process. And I guess just to remind us, we know that clinical handover, or the failure of clinical handover, has often been identified as the major cause of preventable harm to patients in hospital. So it was a really important piece of work that I think, came out of that project. So the first thing they asked was, they did some literature review, of course, they did some surveys, and they did some focus groups. And out of that, they certainly got a bit of information to try and work out what they needed to do. And they wanted to find out first, did we actually have the problem? Was there a problem worth solving? So as you can see here, only 2% thought there was enough information being given that allowed for that effective transfer of care from one team to another. 40% thought that ISBAR tool, which is the one we pretty much we're meant to use, that it was rarely used. And 52% thought that the information provided was rarely relevant or concise. So there's some pretty strong messages that came out there out of those focus groups, I think. And I think there's lots of reasons behind it too. When you think about it, it's quite stressful in the emergency department doing what we have to do, and then the emotions that go with that, and then transferring to the ICU, that's also a little bit daunting sometimes. So I think there's lots of reasons behind it, but anyway. So some of the data that came out of it, how satisfied were they with the current process? And you can see that not that many were that satisfied with it. And what were some of the barriers? So some of the barriers that they certainly talked about that I think is quite interesting is that the staff were often not ready for handover because they just got a really busy ICU, and so it was hard for them to actually sort of organise themselves. And the biggest thing I thought was really interesting, and I saw it all the time, and that was distraction or inattention. And I think sometimes we as ED nurses were also doing the same thing years ago when an ambulance arrived, and we'd be quickly trying to put on the monitoring and quickly trying to do the stuff we felt needed to be done, and we didn't give the ambulance officers that due respect for handover. So we changed that, and that's very different now. We see a really good improvement in that, and we don't do anything until AMBOs have handed over. So we were seeing the same thing when we moved to ICU. I felt that the ICU nurses were spending time connecting kids to ventilators, getting on their monitoring, doing that sort of thing, and not giving us the same sort of respect. So I just think it was something that I identified quite a bit. I was probably a culprit. I used to be an ICU nurse, so I'm sure I did the same thing. How could the current process be improved? So there were some suggestions there, definitely, from the focus groups that came in the surveys. Certainly having a primary doctor or nurse handover, doctor and nurse essentially, using the a checklist like ISBAR, and the hands-off principle. They were the main things that came out of it. So essentially, this is what happened. This is what they developed, is a guideline that gave that sort of talked to these principles. So that one person speaks at a time. There was no separate conversations. The distractions and interruptions would be minimised. There'd be a hands-off approach until the ED responsible for the patient had actually handed over, completed the handover, and that they would follow an ISBAR approach. So this is when I came into the project. I was asked, would I help simulate a little bit of a handover from ED to ICU. So we set up a sim up in the sim centre, and the project team actually just did that handover. So it wasn't a major sim, but it was a nice simple sim to try and see if it actually worked. It was about testing words on a page, I felt. What was interesting in developing the sim, we decided to do a quick cheat sheet, like a draft cheat sheet for what you had to do when you handed over. So we simmed it, we videoed it, we watched it, we then reviewed that guideline, and out of that sim we realised that the most useful thing was to have a laminated tool, something that made it something that made it really easy for that person to use as they were handing over, rather than a long wordy guideline that sits on the policy side. So that handover checklist there that you can see there is sort of the end result of that, although what we did do was another simulation that was getting a patient in ED, stabilising the patient, and then transferring all the way to ICU. So we simmed the whole thing, and we educated a group who were going to be in the sim with the original pilot simulation. We used that. We used a PowerPoint, and then we put them in a sim, and we got them to do the whole transfer process. And we got feedback from them, and we videoed that as well. So we ended up with the checklist. As you can see, we have many laminated copies that sit in our resus room now. And we also ended up with a fantastic video so that when we decided to educate and roll it out and implement, we had a PowerPoint, we had a video, and we had sim. Oh my God, 5 minutes. That's really annoying. So that's okay. We had a PowerPoint, we had a video, and we had a simulation. And we continue to incorporate it into sim all the time. So we're going to show a little bit of the video. Thank you, Stephen. Just so you get a bit of an idea. Hopefully. Oh, not happening? It will happen. I thought I'd just show you I thought I'd show you a snapshot of the video. Oh, we spent so long trying to fix this up, Stephen, didn't we? What a shame. I'm always troubled by videos. While you're doing that, I guess... oh, is it coming? Lovely. Thank you.
They've given some iron to Dad. Can we get out another dose of iron from Dad's hand? But also start getting ready phenytoin. Yep. Hi guys, I've got Jack here. Great. Thank you.
So Stephen, I'll get you to move along a bit.
Yes,
thanks.
But if everyone keeps quiet so we can hear.
Oh, you sure?
That'd be great.
Okay.
So we've got Jack hand over, and then we can.
Okay, just can you pause it for a second, Steve? Thank you. You're doing such a good job there. That's great. I thought I'd move on. So we actually have a video that does the whole, stabilising that patient, moving through to intubation. We sort of had great editing skills from the sim centre. And then we transferred the sim patient, round to ICU. Just to warn you, there's lots of people in the background. We get that because there's a lot of people watching and filming and all that sort of thing. But I then just thought, so this is just as we've arrived in the ICU and with our lovely mannequin, and this just goes on to show you a little bit more about sort of what happened there. Thank you, Stephen. You could just do that.
Is Jack's mother, so he'd like to stand up as well. So I'm Min Berry, one of the ED consultants on today, and we've been looking after Jack is 2 years old, and he's been brought in by ambulance. Hi. So Jack's 2 years old. He's
Thank you, Stephen. That's good.
With a backbone from home.
So it's about an 8-minute video altogether. The lovely things were that we then ended up... Oh, I'll go back. We ended up with this amazing, this really good gold standard video because the people in the sim did such a great job. It was a really good example of how do we prepare, plan, stabilise and then intubate a child and transfer the child to ICU. So it ended up with this fantastic video that we now use in lots of situations. So, back to the project. I'm excited about that because I'm a nurse educator and I'm in sim. So sim was an amazing way to get it out on the floor sort of thing. So the evaluation and the results essentially, because there's been audits done. So you can see so these were some of the things that people were asked, they were observed in ICU. So you can see that there's been a fairly good improvement in most aspects, particularly about a structured approach of giving handover, about hands-off, and about the clear leadership sort of thing. So I think that was really good, and a real reduction in interruptions. We've got a lot of work still to involve the parents in the handover process, and I think that's probably where we, and comes in nicely with your involving parents in sort of how they feel and stuff. And some parents might not want to, but at least sort of giving them the opportunity. So essentially, the whole project was a very exciting project, I think, and a really successful one, I think. I think we used simulation really well in this project, initially to pilot what we thought was going to be good, realised we needed more, and then we used simulation again to get even better uptake, I suppose, and a great way to implement with the video and the education, the PowerPoint, along with the tool, the checklist that we've got. We've got the gold standard video that we use in lots of our simulation days, and that's a really valuable resource. I think what we need to think about is that we have been doing ongoing audits, but we probably just need to be mindful that we don't let them drop off the bandwagon sort of thing. And I just want to think a little bit more about how we can measure that improved handover and how that's affected patient care, I suppose, between the ED and ICU. Thank you.
Thank you. It's very useful.
Right.
So you're collecting information before and ongoing audits.
So we collected it, they collected it before they started the project, before they did the education and stuff. And then and now that we've implemented it, we've been collecting it since to see if people are doing what.
So you're going to write it up so that people don't have to reinvent the wheel?
Yeah, probably. It's a good idea.
Thank you.
I agree.
So that would be perfect for
Yeah.
the ANJ.
Yep.
Is what
Oh,
I'm
good.
saying.
Okay. Okay. Yes, I'm sure we will.
Yes. Well done in identifying the hands-off principle. I think that's probably fantastic and something I'd like to carry back to my ED-ICU. I've worked across both areas.
Yeah.
And I just wondered, in creating the handover tool, as far as your relevant information, I know that ED is all about stabilization and all that, whereas ICU is more long-term and ongoing restorative care. Did you find that there was major discrepancies when you were trying to create your tool and what people thought the relevant information was, or was it just fairly baseline clinical?
I guess because I wasn't part of that process, like the project team working out what was relevant information, I don't know. All I can assume, and Yvonne I know was in the project team and might be able to elaborate further, but they must have, they did everything together, ED and ICU together, so they must have come to an agreement as to what they thought was relevant, and that's, I don't know, there mustn't have been too much of a challenge there, I suppose.
There were definitely some differences in terms of what ICU really wanted on there versus what we thought was important.
Yeah.
So did you go with systems or did you go with...
We worked on it together, and we looked at what worked for us from an ED perspective, and then
what they were looking for.
looking
And the end product was, how did you, like, your handover, was it head to toe, was it systems based,
It was using the
ISBAR and A to G, essentially, definitely.
Excellent.
So with capturing the handover, is there any thoughts to doing it electronically? So having we've got a reward, ED reward electronic handover tool. So you've got a computer there at the time.
So interestingly, we simmed the handover when we were introducing electronic BTF just recently. So we ran a little bit of a sim with 3 scenarios. One was just the deteriorating patient in ED and putting in stuff. One was transferring a patient to the ward and handing over using electronic safe for handover stuff as well as the electronic observations, and then one was to ICU. It took 3 times as long for the ICU consultant to hand over the relevant information when she was trying to use the screen. So she actually found that quite hard. But I guess we don't have electronic places to go to tick off when we get to that place to do our handover now.
Yeah.
So that may be something that's built in. And I think for the critical care ones, we're only just electronic, so we're probably not even, Lynn might be able to talk to this, we're not into the habit yet, perhaps with our critical care, that we're doing safe for discharge. So do you have, is that what you mean, like a safe for discharge, they're okay to go?
Yeah, we have an ED to ward handover tool,
Yeah.
and it covers everything, family members being involved in the whole process.
Yeah.
And it's taken a little while to get used to it.
Yeah.
But it's
So
actually-
I
it's
think,
actually very good because it captures everything.
Yeah.
So, like if you're working up the tool, it's kind of anecdotal whether or not all of those issues have been covered in the handover. You know what I mean? You can't really have a look at it. When you've got an electronic signature that you've ticked off everything that you've covered, the verification, it's a really
Yeah.
good process.
It is.
Very true, and it's a forced safety model that I think the medical record, as it rolls out increasingly, there are processes and systems that we had reasonably rigid, and with the rollout of the electronic record, it's much looser, and there's not a forced signature, there's not forced safety against it. And I think that the designers didn't necessarily have as much clinical engagement. I can only talk for New South Wales with the Cerner product. There definitely wasn't enough clinician engagement at that level of how do you do your work, and how will this help you do your work.
Well, you can borrow ours if you like. It's quite nice.
Yeah.
But I don't think it works well. It's mandatory, and we're refining it, but it needs refinement. But I also think it's very different handing over a stable patient to the ward than handing over a critically vulnerable patient.
so I think it's definitely, there's work, that's probably our next step.
And the only other problem is that you're actually not at the patient. You know what I mean? Because you need a computer to hand over, and you may not be at the patient. So that's the only.
Well, we insist that you have to have a computer beside the patient.
No, but you use a computer on that wheels, but they're not with the patient. Because you can do a phone handover, so you're not actually seeing the person that's picking the patient up. Can get a phone handover.
At ward level?
At ward level.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
With ICU, you would use that.
So you wouldn't do that with ICU
No,
though,
but
so
I
yeah.
think with ward level, it's better if they can actually see the patient.
Having said
Yes,
that,
I
when
agree.
we go to ICU, we're doing it over the phone.
Are you?
So,
Okay.
yeah.
In a paediatric environment.
Or adult environment?
This is for everybody, we're
And this-
rural hospital,
yeah.
so, we're never
Yeah.
physically there, so we can never like
Oh.
that. So the electronic way of touching it would be really good for us.
Yeah.
Mm.
Anyway.
Okay, thank you.